Welcome to our special Dispatch podcast on Fridays. I'm your host, Sarah Isger, joined by Steve Hayes. This podcast is brought to you by thedispatch.com. Come try our free membership trial. It's thedispatch.com/30 days free, and you can join us for our special Dispatch Live right after the debates next week. And it'll be super fun. We'd love for you to join us. Try it out. No risk. And you can get all of our special newsletters that are for members only. Hop into the comments section, which is my favorite comments section on the internet, and be part of our little weird family. We'll hear a little later today from our sponsor, Gabby. But first, today we are joined by Carrie Severino. She is the president of the Judicial Crisis Network, co-author with Molly Hemingway of the best-selling book, Justice on Trial, The Kavanaugh Confirmation and the Future of the Court. Look, she's just an expert on Supreme Court confirmation process, and she's here with us today. I'm super pumped. Let's dive right in. Carrie, super pumped to have you here. You're one of my favorite people on the planet. But I want to start with a forward-looking question. What do you say to Republicans, let's say, but voters in general who are saying, look, set aside this Supreme Court nomination. What about sort of a fundamental, there's like a luck and an unfairness to this, that Donald Trump got 3 Supreme Court nominations during his first term, and Barack Obama and George W. Bush only got 2 for their entire time. Shouldn't we be looking at ways to fix this in the future, or else we're going to keep having these escalations?
Well, look, the escalations aren't because of the number of seats that Donald Trump got to fill versus someone else. The escalations have been going on a long time, starting in 1980 with Robert Bork. So that's not what's causing this. Sure, there are a lot of people who's proposed different ideas, like having term limits and staggering the seats or different things like that, all of which are really interesting. They all have a little bit of a challenge of how do you phase them in so you don't, have one party or the other unfairly advantaged by it. But the big challenge of those is they would all require a constitutional amendment. So lots of interesting ideas. I would be happy to support one, but it's certainly not something that's going to happen anytime in the near future. What we see just historically is the Supreme Court vacancies don't come up evenly. Some people, like President Carter, got 0 Supreme Court vacancies, although he did get to fill hundreds and hundreds of other seats he created on the federal courts. Some people get more. This time we've seen that we got 3 in a short period of time. And that's just how those seats open up at some point. I think what's worrying to me is the escalation. I absolutely agree, a real concern. And I think particular when now we're talking about things like packing the court, which is something that's been a big, move on the left, something that, Biden was one of the few Democratic nominee potentials to reject initially, but now is refusing to rule out. And Harris, of course, is someone who I think has always been open to this. That really worries me. That's something that even people like Bernie Sanders and Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself are on record saying, bad idea. If you want to escalate the problem, that's how you do it. Because that would, as Sanders has said, you add 2 seats, they add 2 seats. Pretty soon you have 87 justices. And Ginsburg pointed to FDR and what a bad idea that was to try to do that. Back in that era, roundly rejected even by his own co-partisans in the Senate. So I think we backing away from that kind of rhetoric is probably the best way to avoid further escalation.
Steve?
Why are we at this point? Why are we at a point where this stuff is so fraught and so partisan and so hostile? How did we get here?
Again, I think if you look back, in fact, you could really trace it back before the Bork era. Molly Hemingway and I, when we were working on Justice on Trial, our book on Justice Kavanaugh, we were interviewing people who were in this business, like Lena McConnell or Ed Meese are going way back, and if you look for most of last century, and then going into this one, the Democrats had a decided advantage, or not even, I don't even think it's fair to say the Democrats, the liberals had an advantage on the Supreme Court. And I say it's not fair to call it the Democrats because many of the conservative nominees were in fact some of the most liberal members of the court. People like Earl Warren, an Eisenhower appointee, Bill Brennan, all of these, those were people that Republicans put on the court. And John Paul Stevens, a Ford appointee, one of the most liberal members of the court. Souter, a Bush appointee. It just time and time and again. And so we had a situation where the left actually had pretty much carte blanche to do, especially during like the Warren era, anything that they couldn't get done in the elected branches, or they couldn't get done. Maybe they got half a loaf in the elected branches. They wanted to come back for that rest of that loaf. That's where they would go to the courts, and they had basically rubber stamp from the courts to do whatever they wanted. When you get to 1980s and President Reagan is suddenly saying, actually, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to have judges who are faithful to the rule of law. And what we learned is that was partly his inspiration to do that was because he had seen as governor of California, some of the stuff he was trying to do, like welfare reform, but all the things he really felt like were top agenda items for him were getting blocked by the courts. So he's like, wait a minute, I realize if you don't have the courts, it doesn't matter what you can get past the Senate, the House. It doesn't matter what legislation you have or your initiatives. You have to have the courts because they're the ones who are going to interpret them. And they're the ones who are going to say, it kind of basically come up with the content sometimes, because you had courts that were literally just adding words to statutes or rewriting statutes and willy-nilly. Once the left realized there was a move to push back on that, that's when you started seeing things like the Bork confirmation. So as soon as they had an opportunity to start blocking someone, they went for it and they went all out. And that was something that really took the Reagan White House by surprise. They didn't see it coming. And that's part of the reason the nomination didn't happen. It continued through, the Bush era when you had the Thomas confirmations, and when there was a chance in that case, not only of losing a swing seat, which was what happened in Bork. We learned that it's when you have a major shift potentially on the line, that's when things get crazy. It doesn't have to do with the nominee so much. It doesn't, although obviously there's a lot to be said for maybe a different nominee would have been more friendly or whatever in Bork's case, but a lot of it had to do with the stakes of the seat and the fact that Democrats had the votes in the Senate to do what they wanted to do. In the Thomas seat, it was Thurgood Marshall to Justice Thomas. Wow, they were losing a major icon on their side and getting someone who now know is the most conservative member of the Supreme Court. Not a trade they wanted to make. And so all hell broke loose. They pulled out all the stops. They went crazy. And again, you see that in the modern era. Gorsuch, which was a serious fight, and people sometimes forget what a big fight that was to get him confirmed. But replacing Scalia with Gorsuch is not a shift on the court. Replacing Kennedy with Kavanaugh was a shift on the court, and that's why it went all sorts of crazy. And then guess what? Replacing Justice Ginsburg on the court with any of these women that we're looking at, all of whom would have a very different. I think they fit right in her in her trailblazing mode in terms of impressive women, mothers, judges, scholars, just real path breakers. But they're not coming from the same judicial perspectives. So you're going to see a lot of fighting going on that front.
Do you think that the court has become too important? And if so, what are things that can be done to get the court out of the culture wars and the voting wars and the electoral politics?
Yeah. And I think that's the other half really to the left being so blazing mad about losing that opportunity to that kind of democracy by other means that they were using on the court, because it's not supposed to be the Democratic branch. But I think you're right. The other aspect to it, and that we've seen really since the New Deal era, is part of the problem is the government itself is so much bigger, the federal government. It used to be that a lot of these issues that today the Supreme Court decides were decided in the states. So the stakes aren't that high. You get 50 different solutions. They much more closely approximate where the American people are. You get a different solution in Texas and in California and in Georgia and in Florida and in New York. They're all going to look a little different, right? That takes a lot of the high stakes issues out as the federal government is smaller. And then the Supreme Court itself, I think, has caused some of this by constitutionalizing issues that frankly are not in the Constitution. Abortion is the one that people most often get into, but there's other areas where they'll make stuff into a constitutional question that's frankly not a U.S. constitutional question. It's kind of this confusion of the idea of, well, if it's constitutional, it must be good. And if it's not constitutional, it must be bad. And likewise, if it's good, it must be required by the Constitution. If it's bad, it must be forbidden by the Constitution. That's just not how it works. That's not the Constitution's job, is to be our ultimate moral signpost. That's why we've got all other things for that. We've got philosophy, we've got religion, and that's not what the Constitution's job is supposed to be. But when people confuse that, they read their own, desires, some of which might be really good, into the Constitution. It makes it a constitutional question rather than leaving it with the Democratic branches.
And I would say even that's even a pretty positive view of the nature of these debates, because that assumes that some on the left still care about the Constitution. So they care enough to frame their arguments as constitutional arguments, whereas you have others on the left who I would argue basically shrug off the Constitution and diminish its importance at every turn.
Oh, yeah. You've got people who are, unfortunately, I think, seem to feel even more emboldened now to kind of say, it's this old 200-year document, who cares? And that's really a major concern, especially when you're thinking these are some of the people who are maybe advising a future president on who to put on the court. Because there are some people, and, for example, you look at this list of extremists that demand justice put out. I mean, this is one of the groups on the left kind of trying to get Joe Biden to put out a list of judges. And the people that they're proposing are, most of them, activists. They're not even judges. There's not even a veneer of, let's put people who are interested in constitutional questions. No. This is people who have spent their lives in the special interest world trying to advance one liberal cause or another. And this is just, another venue in which to do that. And that's a really frightening prospect to me.
Looking ahead to Saturday, we're going to get the announcement of a nominee. And we're going to have hearings potentially starting the 12th, according to some reports. Mm-hmm. What are you looking for to judge a successful hearing? And what are we to make of Josh Hawley, Senator Hawley from Missouri's pledge that he will vote against a nominee who will not say on the record that she, in this case, will support overturning Roe v. Wade?
So first of all, for the hearing part of it, everyone, I think at this point, realizes hearings are mostly kabuki theater, and probably I would say good riddance if we decided not to do them at all. I don't think we're going to do that anytime soon. Obviously, in many parts of American history, most of American history, there haven't been hearings at this point, and it partly even because sort of the legacy of Justice Ginsburg. She was the first one to refuse to answer questions about her judicial perspective on things, but she's kind of the most famous. There were at least 60 different questions she didn't answer about what she believed, how she would rule in certain cases. And she cited judicial ethics standards and said, I can't talk about how these cases are going to go. So all of the things people care about the most, including Josh Hawley, maybe, I would love to know how she would vote in this case. Sure. But you know what? They're not going to answer it. And they actually, it is pretty clear, because when you look at people who are already sitting judges, they're not taking someone off the street who's not bound by these rules yet. This is someone who's already a sitting judge, bound by the federal ethics rules, and they can't, as she said, no hints, no forecasts, no predictions. I can't tell you how I'm going to vote specifically in this case. And so there are going to be hearings. They're probably not going to shed. There will be more heat than light, like normal. I think on a positive note, just for the sanity of everyone involved, given a COVID world, they're not going to likely have anyone who is a outside group people able to come. There's going to be probably, I'm assuming there's going to be press. I'm not sure. I'm assuming there's going to be like Senate, staffers and whatnot, and senators all sitting 6 feet apart, but they're not going to have public seats. And you know what? Thank goodness, because I don't think we need another code pink like rally in the hearing room where people are getting dragged out every 5 seconds. That wasn't really helpful for getting through the process. It'll be much more efficient this time as a result. I'm hoping the senators, last time the Democratic senators decided they were going to be the protesters too. They interrupted Senator Grassley's introduction so often that his 10-minute introductory statement took literally an hour. So, I hope we don't see that this time. I don't think it played really well for those watching at home on C-SPAN. So I'm hoping they realize that wasn't a good move. So we're going to have hearings. We're going to learn some aspects. I think it'll be a good opportunity to get to for the American people to get to know one of these women as well. We know that Judge, jumping ahead of myself, Judge Amy Coney Barrett last time had a really stellar exchange with Senator Feinstein. I think that was more stellar for her than for Feinstein, because Feinstein's, grilling her on her Catholic faith. And are you an Orthodox Catholic? And I think the dogma lives loudly within you. And that's a cause for concern. that was walking right up to the unconstitutional religious test for office line. I think if we see those kind of things, that'll be another opportunity to see her grace under pressure. That was where she first rose to national prominence, because people saw her and they're like, wow, she's not backing down. She's not trying to hide from what she believes, but she also had a very great and careful, thought out answer of why that's not at all relevant to her judicial function. And let's talk about the judicial stuff. And then just quick, finally, to go to the test. I talked a little bit about how judges, and I think whether it's Lagoa or Barrett, they're not going to tell you whether how to vote in cases because they're both federal judges and can't do that. But I think aside from the impracticability of the test, and some people have said, well, that's not even a practical test because if you have to get everyone on the record, you're going to lose all these moderate Republican votes. Now you can't count to 50. I think the bigger issue is that's not really a judge's job. It's to guarantee to you how he or she is going to vote in a case. That goes against the idea of a judge being a neutral arbiter of the law and not prejudging cases. I'll also point out.
So, will you try to convince? Will you try to convince Senator Hawley to drop his test?
I've written kind of talking about this test in the Federalist, and I think other people have questioned whether it's a good test. The other people just on practical measures. His test and the way he's wording it a little differently nowadays. But the way he words it, I think it literally includes Justice Ginsburg. I mean, like it is vague enough. She expressed concern about Roe versus Wade, so much so that some pro-abortion groups were actually skeptical about her when she went up for the Supreme Court, because she had said she thought it was wrongly decided insofar as she doesn't actually agree with the legal analysis in that decision. I think she would probably get there through the Equal Protection Clause or through some other, constitutional magic, but not. She didn't think it was decided correctly in that decision. And she thought it was decided at a bad time because, like we were talking before, she thought this took something out of the public discourse in a way that was really harmful to the American public. And so she could pass that test. So how good is your test, Senator Hawley? I don't know.
Well, it's good if your objective is to get headlines and attention. And I think that has happened. You mentioned Amy Coney Barrett, interested in going there. Obviously, the conventional wisdom is that she is likely to be the nominee. I would be very interested to know if you think that conventional wisdom is right. If you have any inside news, we'd be happy to break it here. And beyond that, we've seen early sort of follow-on attacks on her faith. In the news media, amplified by Democrats, sometimes the other way around. If it's her, do you expect that will be the focus of this battle?
Well, so far, first of all, I'm hearing the same received wisdom as you have. So I think that she does seem like definite front runner at this point, just a day away from the announcement. And so far, I think that's what we have seen from the left. Obviously, it's what we saw at her lower court proceedings. There's a lot of reasons to assume they're not going to go down the Kavanaugh route of doing sexual assault allegations, right? Because it's a woman. Frankly, also because with their vice presidential candidate having similar allegations against him, it might be a little bit awkward to try to make that argument. That doesn't mean I would really put anything past them, because some of the language you're hearing from people on the left is really shocking and frankly, I think threatening, where they're saying, we have to remember we need to be radicalized and nothing's off the table. And these are from people who are literally setting things on fire and causing actual violence. So I'm concerned about what other directions it can go. Right now, it does look like it's the anti-Catholic route. It's also fits kind of with a theme we've seen, because it's not just Barrett that's gotten attacked for her Catholic faith. Senator Harris herself has attacked several nominees because of their membership of the Knights of Columbus, basically treating this nationwide charitable organization as if it were a hate group, simply because they hold to the Catholic faith. Again, no religious test for office, folks. It's right there in our founding document. You can't do that, and it's disturbing to see that. I also think if they do that, it's not gonna look good. It'll just like I don't think it looked good for Feinstein or for Harris when they were going down that road. I think that's not what the American people want to see, and it doesn't fit with Justice Ginsburg's own legacy. She talked very eloquently about how her Jewish faith inspired her in wanting to go into the law in a search for justice. And that's exactly what America stands for. We got people on both sides of the aisle who feel that their faiths and all different, but from all different faiths who find that inspiration in that for their lives, for their public service. And that's something we should be embracing, not attacking.
Let's take a quick break and hear from our sponsor, Gabby. When you've had the same car insurance or homeowner's insurance for years, you kind of get trapped into paying your premiums and not thinking about it. That makes it really easy to overpay and not even realize it. Stop overpaying for car and homeowner's insurance. See about getting a lower rate for the exact same coverage you already have thanks to Gabby. Gabby takes the pain out of shopping for insurance by giving you apples-to-apples comparisons of your current coverage with 40 of the top insurance providers like Progressive, Nationwide, and Travelers. Just link your current insurance account, and in just minutes, you'll be able to see quotes for the exact same coverage that you already have. Gabby customers save an average of $825 per year. If they can't find you savings, they'll let you know so you can relax knowing you have the best rate out there. And they'll never sell your info, so no annoying spam or robocalls. It's totally free to check your rate, and there's no obligation. Take a few minutes and stop overpaying on your car and homeowner's insurance the second this pod is over. Go to Gabby.com/dispatch. That's GABI.com/dispatch. Gabby.com/dispatch. A lot I have seen on the left has been about the future of healthcare and the future of abortion rights. Assume that it's Amy Coney Barrett or Judge Lagoa, Barbara Lagoa. How is the court going to look after November, 1st, let's say, when they're confirmed, one of them? What changes?
Obviously look, it's funny because the questions about healthcare are obviously not really about healthcare. They're about either statutory interpretation or the Commerce Clause. And frankly, there's already 5 votes on the court without replacing Justice Ginsburg to say the Commerce Clause does not justify an individual mandated if it is not a tax. So if there's not, that is something that I'm not sure this will even necessarily affect. But I can tell it definitely polls well for them, because I was amazed that even I was on TV right after an ABC right after Nancy Pelosi Sunday morning, and I thought even she was going to go straight for Roe versus Wade. She didn't. She just said this whole thing's about COVID and Obamacare, and I was like, the Supreme Court's about COVID. Okay, that tells me where your message testing is, but it doesn't really compute for me. But so clearly they think this is going to be a key issue. I'm not sure she's even the 5th vote on that. So I'm not sure that actually adds up in terms of the vote. In terms of abortion, I think that's actually also kind of a question that we really, we'll see. But I do predict that either of these women would clearly have a different perspective on that issue and on how you interpret constitutional rights than Justice Ginsburg. We don't have either of them on the record saying, I don't think there's a constitutional right to abortion anywhere. So we don't know in that sense. But we do know that these are women who have histories. In Lagoa's case, going back to 2006 in the bench, and Amy Coney Barrett's for the last few years, and then with her scholarship as well, of saying that the Constitution means what is written and the original understanding thereof, and it's hard to figure out, how to get to some of the conclusions that Justice Ginsburg had if that's your approach to the Constitution.
Well, it's easy to imagine that Nancy Pelosi wants to talk about healthcare and COVID because those are the things on the minds of Democratic voters. The one way in which this is, I think, certainly politically advantageous for President Trump and Republicans is that at the very least, it virtually guarantees that this will be one of the 2 or 3 big topics of discussion through the election. And if the assumption was, and I think it was a correct assumption, that before this, it would likely be COVID and the economic fallout from COVID. And I think I would say President Trump's mishandling of this, it's a gift to President Trump to be able to change the subject. That's one of the reasons Nancy Pelosi would like to keep talking about COVID and healthcare. But pulling back the camera a little bit more broadly, you've been involved in these things for a long time. You know sort of the politics of judicial nominations as well as probably anybody. Sarah's made an argument for a while, I think a convincing one, that generally speaking, these kind of fights motivate Republican voters, conservative voters more than they do Democrats. Is that still true in this case, do you think?
Well, we haven't had, obviously every vacancy looks slightly different. The layout is slightly different. And a lot of people are saying because it's Ginsburg, people on the left are going to be more activated than they normally would. That may be. I just think that nonetheless, we do know historically it has been conservatives who have been incredibly engaged by the Supreme Court. And I think it kind of goes back to what we were discussing earlier, where it's conservatives who have mostly been on the receiving end of judicial activism. The liberals have kind of taken it for granted as a tool in their toolbox. Conservatives have, in time again, had so many courts ruling and misruling in ways that undermined issues they really cared about. And so I think that's why it's such an engaging issue for conservatives. And I think it's something that, everyone always knows there's going to be a Supreme Court vacancy. So to some extent, people, anyone who's been paying attention knows that it was likely that there was going to be another Supreme Court vacancy in the relatively near future. Whether it was Ginsburg or Breyer or someone else, it's going to be someone. And I think a lot of people assumed it was going to be Ginsburg, right? So this was already in everyone's back of their mind. Now it's in the front of their mind. And I think that in 2016, we saw that did have a huge effect, in one that where it affected people breaking decidedly for Trump. It was 1/5 of voters that said it was their number one issue, but those in that 1/5 that said it was number one issue broke decidedly, very lopsidedly for Trump. So I think if history is any guide, we're going to see that effect again. But we won't know that until November, or whenever we actually find out the results of the election. I don't know if anyone trusts exit polls this year, but
whenever the Supreme Court decides, right, according to
right, and whether there's 8 justices or 9 justices to decide that may determine whether we get locked in a deadlock for for the next 4 years while we debate this.
Did Republican senators make a mistake with the Garland nomination by saying that it was because it wasn't an election year? Did Lindsey Graham's discussion, even after Justice Kavanaugh's confirmation that he would not confirm another justice in a presidential election year, is that costing Republicans in terms of how voters see the hypocrisy issue? Or is it we can, so we will?
So I think the question there boils down to historic precedent, and there is very clear historical precedent that is. It's not because I don't think it's wrong to discuss the fact that it's an election year, because that's what makes that is the key factor in the historical precedent we're looking here. But there's 2 key factors, and one question is we're looking at elections in vacancies that arise during an election year, right? And the other factor, there's 29 of those historically, and in all of the cases that's happened, a president has made a nomination. So in both 2016 and 2020, squarely in historical precedent, Obama made a nomination, Trump made a nomination. The question that helps you determine which of these get confirmed is who controlled the Senate when that happened. And that also shouldn't really be a surprise.
But that's not what Lindsey Graham said.
You know what? Lindsey Graham has shifted his positions a couple times on judges. I don't want to be accountable for what Lindsey Graham has said on these things.
A couple times is generous.
Yeah. So I'm not. But I will tell you what I think is. I'm not saying Lindsey Graham's position is a principled one. I'll tell you what I think the principled position is, and I think Leader McConnell actually has held a principled position, and that is that if you look at the history, the precedent is if the White House and the Senate are controlled by different parties, then that nominee is not confirmed. And if the White House and the Senate are controlled by the same party, he is confirmed. That's no surprise. The Senate says it takes these 2 political actors to do it. Effectively, it's like when the American people give the 2 different parties these things, you kind of have a tie. And then it's no surprise that the results of the election are effectively the American people breaking that tie. Here, in 2018, the American people actually gave the Senate a wider GOP majority. That's not tapping the brakes like you had in 2014, where they took the majority away from the president. That's saying full steam ahead. And so they're getting what they said.
That all makes perfect sense. But then how can Republicans argue against, if Democrats were to take the Senate and the presidency, argue against court packing? Because it's the same sort of, that's what the Constitution says. If the president and the Congress are controlled by the same party, they can add justices to the Supreme Court. They can get rid of the filibuster or anything else. It goes back to that can, so we will versus we can, so should we.
Right. And I think that the question is, the American people want that to be politicized in that way. So yeah, there's no question that the Supreme Court can have any number of justices that you want to establish by law. We do have a more than 100-year precedent of having 9 justices. And I think most people, again, including Bernie Sanders, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and probably including FDR by the end of his life when he realized, that didn't work out very well when he tried it, realized that messing with those numbers actually can cause problems with these norms. There is a norm for not confirming nominees in an election year if you're a party opposed to the president, and there is a norm for confirming them in the election year. There is not a modern norm for let's switch the number of seats so we can have a majority on the court. And I'll point out too, it's really kind of frustrating hearing some of these things from people like Joe Biden or people. There were scholars, there were legal law professors, and I would almost put scholars in quote marks saying basically there's a constitutional obligation to have a vote on a judge in an election year. So the argument that McConnell said, which is basically, if you want to do the crudest version, if we can, we will. Their argument is no, the Constitution says you must have a vote. So if they really thought it was constitutionally mandated in 2016, query what has changed about the Constitution in 2020. That's the fastest constitutional evolution, even for a living constitutionalist, I have seen. And I recall Liz Warren, my own law professor, I don't know if you had Professor Warren, saying that was constitutionally required. And I thought, Professor Warren, like, when did you forget all law on earth? Like, of course, it's not constitutionally required to have a vote in a particular time. We know people have many judges have not received votes in American history, and many of them have. And there's no constitutional requirement here. So I would say the Democrat standard seems to be, if it's a Democrat nominee, they should have a vote, and you got to have a vote. And if it's a Republican nominee, they shouldn't have a vote. That, to me, is a really hypocritical standard.
Last question to you, Steve.
One of the most interesting things to come out of the Kavanaugh hearings for me, just on a political or on a political messaging perspective, has been the divergent views on how Kamala Harris conducted herself. If you talk to my friends on the left, they think this was a star turn for her. They think she grilled him very effectively. She suggested she had information, and she really sort of put the screws to him. Talk to anybody on the center right, and they think she whiffed. She didn't end up with the goods. It was a lot of bluster without producing much. What do you see her doing in these coming hearings, given the proximity to the election, given the fact that she's the vice presidential nominee on the Democratic side, and given what she went through during the Kavanaugh hearings?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, if you thought she was auditioning for president during the Kavanaugh confirmation, which she clearly was, she must have thought she did great, because she ran literally thousands of different ads, like 3,600 different Facebook ads based on her stuff there, despite the fact that, I obviously would agree with those in the center right, said she was doing this Perry Mason routine that really fell flat. And you even had some kind of liberal media saying, it kind of turned out to be a nothing burger. And she was, misstating some of his statements about trying to make it seem like he was arguing that abortion, or that contraception all causes abortion, or things like that, when he was quoting a plaintiff's position in a case he was reading. So things like that, totally, not legit arguments. Some of this made for TV moments where she stomped out of a hearing and said she just couldn't say anything. She was a mom, and she and Senator Booker like walked out in silence, and then went to a press conference and talked about how great they were. So, from my perspective, I think that falls flat. Maybe some people are engaged by it. I think the real question is, clearly those on the far left are going to be, what about the moderate Democratic voters? Do they really think that's good? But again, if she was auditioning for president then, she thinks she's got it in the bag now. I think she thinks she's president-elect effectively if she wins if Biden wins. I think she's just kind of waiting in the wings. So she's certainly going to view this as another political opportunity. What is that going to look like? It's hard to imagine. Again, she's already gone down the anti-Catholic route, so I think she certainly might go down that route again. I don't think that's very consistent for the party of JFK and for Ginsburg's own party to carry on those anti-religious tests. But that's her call. I think it'll be interesting, because it could be almost, this is the vice presidential debate you didn't know you needed, but it's effectively between Amy Coney Barrett and Senator Kamala Harris. So I guess we're going to find out tune in with popcorn, but I think she's going to certainly be trying to do some of those same, whether it's a perjury trap or the made for TV moment that the hearings are going to provide her as a member of the Judiciary Committee. It will at least require her to get out of the basement with Biden. So
the Severino family is into escape rooms. Mm-hmm. How does one do an escape room during COVID?
Unfortunately, thus far, one doesn't, although there's some online ones that we're trying to maybe get a group together to do. But my husband's cousins just sent this awesome game where it's like an escape room in a box. They're the ones who introduced us to escape rooms, and we're like, this is the best thing ever. We've literally done dozens of these. So this is going to be our first time, not our first time doing an escape room in our home, because actually 2 of our children created an escape room in our basement a few years ago, which was truly challenging and pretty impressive with some twists and turns. But this is going to be interesting. So we're going to try to do this weekend. If we can get everyone one place, escape room in a box, I'll let you know how it goes.
Steve, have you ever done an escape room?
No, I've had lots of life experiences that have felt like escape rooms, but no, I've never actually done an escape room. My oldest daughter loves
maybe
them.
2020 is an escape room.
Maybe it feels like it's less
Time
fun.
is running out. Please just open the door.
Well, Carrie, thank you so much for joining us, especially this week of all weeks. I know, tomorrow at 5 p.m. is kind of your Christmas, New Year's, everything wrapped into one. So we'll be rooting for you.
All right. Thanks.